The thick, late May humidity of Austin, Texas, pressed down like a wet blanket, clinging to the concrete and asphalt after a brief, violent thunderstorm. It was a heat that promised no relief, a suffocating warmth that carried the smell of damp soil and hot pavement. For Clara, though, the oppressive heat was a distant second to the bone-deep exhaustion weighing on her eyelids. At 26, Clara was a pediatric nurse with kind eyes and hair the color of sun-bleached hay, usually held in a neat bun, though now stray strands clung to her face. She'd just pulled a double shift at the Del Seaton Medical Center, and her feet ached in rhythm with the dull throb in her temples. The city bus ride home was a smear of neon lights streaking across rain-slicked windows, but as she stepped onto the sidewalk near her apartment complex, her senses snapped back into sharp focus. The street, usually bustling on a Friday night, was eerily quiet, the shadows stretching long and distorted under the buzzing, humid halos of the streetlights. Clara clutched the strap of her tote bag, her knuckles turning white. She'd lived in this neighborhood for 2 years, and while it was generally safe, recent chatter from the older residents about strangers loitering near the community park had set everyone on edge. As she walked the 2 blocks to her building, the slap of footsteps behind her echoed off the brick facades. They were heavy, deliberate steps, not the quick cadence of a late-night jogger. She paused, feigning a check of her phone, and the footsteps stopped a beat later. When she resumed walking, they started again. 3 of them. She could feel their presence more than see it, a cluster of darkness reflected in the puddles she stepped around. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of warning. She picked up her pace, the safety of her apartment building looming ahead like a fortress. She fumbled with her key fob at the lobby, the heavy glass door swinging shut just as 3 figures rounded the corner. She didn't look back to see if they stopped. She just had to get to the 3rd floor. The lobby was empty. The usual night security guard was away from his desk, likely dealing with a maintenance issue, leaving the space feeling exposed. Clara jabbed the elevator button repeatedly, willing the doors to slide open. When they finally did, she scrambled inside and pressed the button for her floor. As the car ascended, she leaned against the cool metal wall, letting out a shaky breath. She was being paranoid, she told herself, the fatigue playing tricks on her mind. But as the elevator chimed and the doors opened on the 3rd floor, her relief shattered. The hallway, normally warm and welcoming with its beige carpeting and soft lighting, now felt like a trap. The stairwell door at the far end of the hall clicked shut. Standing between her and her apartment door were the 3 men from the street. They must have sprinted up the stairs while she waited for the elevator. They weren't much older than her, but they carried a menace that filled the narrow space. The one in the middle, wearing a dark leather jacket that seemed 2 sizes too big, stepped forward with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. He was flanked by 2 others, one in a gray hoodie and the other chewing on a toothpick with an air of lazy arrogance. They weren't just loitering, they were hunting. Clara froze, her hand still gripping her bag. "Long night, sweetheart?" the man in the leather jacket asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. He didn't move fast. He moved with the confidence of someone who knows their prey has nowhere to run. "Look like you could use some company." The other 2 chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound that made Clara's skin crawl. She took a step back, but the elevator doors were already closed behind her. "Please, just let me pass," Clara said, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound authoritative. "My husband is waiting inside," she lied, hoping the threat of another man might deter them. The man in the hoodie laughed out loud. "We watched you walk in alone. There's nobody waiting for you." They took another step, closing the distance. Clara backed away until her shoulders hit the wall. The air in the hallway suddenly felt thin, suffocating. She thought of the pepper spray buried somewhere at the bottom of her bag, but she knew she'd never have time to reach it. Just as the leader reached out a hand to touch her arm, a soft chime broke the tension. The 2nd elevator, farther down the hall near her apartment, had arrived. The doors slid open silently. Caleb stepped out. At 35, Caleb was a man who filled a space with a quiet, undeniable intensity. He wore a simple pair of gray sweatpants and a navy blue hoodie that did little to hide his broad, powerful shoulders. He had a handsome but weathered face, etched with the lines of someone who had seen too much of the world's dark corners, a Navy SEAL on active leave, though the neighborhood knew him only as the quiet, polite man in 3B. But it wasn't just Caleb who emerged. At his side, held by a loose leather leash, was Kaiser. Kaiser was a formidable, 4-year-old German shepherd, his coat a rich pattern of sable and black. His ears were perpetually pricked, swiveling like radar dishes, and his eyes were intelligent amber pools that missed nothing. They were returning from a late-night run, both breathing in easy rhythm, their movements in sync. The tableau in the hallway froze. Caleb took in the situation in a single, practiced glance. The young woman's terrified posture, pressed against the wall. The three men in a predatory semicircle, the scent of fear and aggression hanging in the air. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. He simply stopped. The sudden stillness of a man that large was more intimidating than any shout. The three thugs turned to the newcomer, their swagger faltering for a moment. "Move along, pal." The leader sneered, trying to regain control. "This has got nothing to do with you." Caleb looked at the man with an expression of utter boredom, though his eyes were as cold as the air conditioning humming in the vents. He loosened his grip on the leash slightly. "Back off," Caleb said. The words were spoken softly, almost a whisper, but they carried the weight of a command that could not be disobeyed. Kaiser's transformation was instantaneous. The friendly, panting dog disappeared. In its place was a guardian. Kaiser's head lowered, the hackles along his spine rising like a jagged mountain range. A growl started deep in his chest, a subsonic rumble that sounded like tectonic plates shifting, a sound that was felt more than heard. He didn't bark. Barking was a warning. This was a promise of violence. He curled his lips back, revealing teeth, white and sharp against black gums, and fixed his gaze on the leader's throat. The dog took one stiff step forward, positioning himself perfectly between the men and Clara. The leader took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide as he stared at the animal. The primal fear of a predator is hardwired into human DNA, and Kaiser was clearly an apex predator. "I said," Caleb repeated, his voice dropping an octave, calm and devoid of fear, "it's time for you to go. Now." He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't raise his fists. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, exuding the supreme confidence of a man who knew exactly what he and his dog were capable of. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt like an eternity. The thug in the hoodie looked from the massive dog to the stone-faced man holding the leash, and his nerve broke. "Let's go, man. This ain't worth it," he muttered, backing toward the stairwell. The leader shot Caleb one last glare, trying to save face, but Kaiser snapped his jaws shut in the air, a loud, chilling clack of teeth, and the man flinched violently. "You got lucky, pal," the thug mumbled, an empty threat as he turned and all but ran for the stairs, his two cronies scrambling after him. The heavy fire door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet hall. Caleb waited until the sound of their footsteps faded down the stairwell before he let out a breath. "Sit," he said quietly. Kaiser immediately relaxed, the ridge of fur on his back smoothing out, his ears perking up in a friendly manner as he looked up at Caleb for approval. Caleb bent down and scratched the dog behind the ears before turning his full attention to the young woman. Clara was still pressed against the wall, her chest heaving, tears of shock welling in her eyes. She had always been wary of Kaiser. Before, whenever she'd seen Caleb and his big dog in the elevator, she would politely wait for the next one, intimidated by the animal's size and wolf-like appearance. Now, looking at the dog who had just stood between her and a nightmare, she saw something else entirely. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Caleb asked, his voice gentle now, the hard edge gone from his tone. He kept a respectful distance, giving her space to breathe. Clara nodded, though her knees felt like jelly. She looked down at Kaiser. The dog padded slowly over to her, sensing her distress. He didn't jump. He simply leaned his heavy, warm body against her leg, offering a silent, solid comfort. Clara sank down, her hand shaking, and buried her fingers in his thick fur. It was solid and warm. I think so," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you. Both of you." Caleb offered a small, reassuring smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "We're neighbors," he said simply. 3B. "Let me walk you to your door." For the first time that night, the icy knot of fear in Clara's stomach began to dissolve, replaced by the warmth of safety and the realization that the monster in the hallway was actually a guardian angel in a fur coat. The bright Saturday sunlight that bathed Austin was a welcome contrast to the cold dread of the night before. It filtered through Clara's kitchen blinds, illuminating dancing dust motes and warming the countertop where a batch of blueberry muffins cooled on a wire rack. Clara hummed a quiet tune, though her hand still had a faint tremor as she arranged the muffins in a woven basket. The horror in the hallway had faded with the daylight, replaced by a lingering unease. But Clara was a woman who believed in the healing power of routine and good manners. She covered the muffins with a checkered napkin and took a deep breath, smoothing down her sweater before stepping out into the hall. The corridor looked innocent now, the beige carpet vacuumed and the walls silent, betraying nothing of the menace that had lurked there hours before. She walked the short distance to apartment 3B and knocked firmly. She could hear movement inside, the thud of heavy footsteps on a hardwood floor, and then the click of a deadbolt. Caleb opened the door, looking different than he had in the shadows. In the daylight, wearing a fitted gray t-shirt and jeans, he looked intensely healthy and alert, the physical readiness of a man still very much in his prime. At his side, Kaiser sat at a perfect attention, his tail giving a slight, rhythmic thump on the floor. "Good morning," Clara said, offering the basket with a shy smile. "I wanted to thank you properly for last night. I don't know what I would have done if you two hadn't stepped out of that elevator." Caleb's expression softened, and he stepped back, motioning for her to enter. "You didn't have to do that, but I appreciate it. Come on in. Coffee's almost ready." Clara stepped into his apartment. It was sparse, meticulously clean, and arranged with military precision, a temporary haven for a man used to being on the move. Kaiser approached Clara slowly, sniffing the air near the basket. "He has a weakness for blueberries," Caleb said with a rare chuckle as he poured 2 mugs of coffee. "But don't let him fool you. He's on a strict diet." They sat at the small kitchen table. As Clara scratched Kaiser behind the ears, she noticed a faint, silver line of fur running along his flank. "A scar. What happened to him?" she asked gently. Caleb looked down at the dog with an expression of deep respect and a touch of sadness. "Shrapnel," Caleb explained, his voice even. "We deployed together overseas. He took a round meant for my team leader during a raid. It wasn't life-threatening, but the trauma to his hip meant he couldn't keep up with operational tempo anymore." Caleb took a sip of coffee. "So he was medically retired. Since I just got back on leave a few weeks ago before my next rotation, I adopted him out. But to be honest, I think it's permanent. He's seen enough war. He deserves a couch and some peace. I'm the one who has to go back, not him." Clara looked at the magnificent animal with a newfound awe. He wasn't just a pet. He was a veteran who had served his time while his master was still in the fight. Caleb set his mug down, his demeanor shifting from casual to professional. "Clara, I've been thinking about last night. I've seen a lot of bad situations, and those men, they weren't typical muggers." Clara's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Muggers are usually opportunists. They want a quick grab, wallet, phone, and then they're gone. These guys had you cornered. They were flanking you, cutting off your escape to the stairs. They weren't looking at your bag. They were looking at you, and they seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Have you noticed anyone watching you before?" Clara shook her head, a chill running down her spine. "No, just the general feeling of unease lately, but nothing specific." Before Caleb could respond, a firm knock on the open door interrupted them. Standing in the threshold was Eleanor. At 72, Eleanor was a petite woman with a bright silver coif that was perfectly curled and eyes that twinkled with a mix of kindness and sharp intelligence. She wore a floral housecoat and carried a newspaper. Eleanor had lived in the building for 30 years and knew the history of every creaky floorboard and every tenant. She was the building's unofficial historian and watchguard. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Eleanor said, her voice clear and crisp. "But I smelled blueberries and I saw the door was open." Her eyes went immediately to the dog. "Hello, Kaiser, you handsome devil." Kaiser's tail thumped enthusiastically. Clearly, Eleanor was a favorite. "Come in, Eleanor," Caleb said, getting up to pull out a third chair. "We were just talking about the incident last night." Eleanor's face clouded over instantly. "I heard about that awful business, but it confirms my suspicions." She sat down, looking from Caleb to Clara. "I didn't want to say anything because I thought I was just being a nosy old woman. But 2 days ago, I saw a van parked across the street. A blue work van, rusted with wells. 2 men sat in it for hours. And yesterday morning, I saw one of them, the one with the toothpick, in the lobby pretending to check the mail. He wasn't looking for letters, honey. He was reading the names on the buzzers." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "They were casing me." Eleanor reached out and patted Clara's hand. "I don't know why, dear, but they were certainly doing their homework. It's why I always use my chain lock." Caleb nodded slowly, processing this information with the calculating mind of an operator. "Reconnaissance," he murmured. "They were verifying a target. This wasn't random." He looked at Clara, his eyes intense. "We need to check your apartment. If they're this brazen, they might have tried to get in before you got home to set something up." The 3 of them left Caleb's apartment and walked back down the hall to Clara's door. It felt different now. No longer just a wooden barrier, but the front line of a conflict she didn't understand. Clara reached into her bag for her keys, her hands trembling again. She inserted the key into the lock, but it didn't turn smoothly. It caught. "That's weird," she whispered, jiggling it. "It always opens easily." Stand back, Caleb said, his voice quiet but commanding. He moved closer to the door, examining the metal plate around the lock. There, almost invisible to the naked eye, but obvious to a trained one, were fresh, jagged scratches. The metal was bent slightly outward. Someone had tried to pick the lock or force it with a tool. Kaiser. Caleb gestured. The German Shepherd moved forward, his nose working overtime. He sniffed at the base of the door, then moved up to the handle. Suddenly, his body went rigid. The fur on his neck stood up, and he let out a single, sharp, high-pitched bark, not a growl, but an alert, a signal. He looked at Caleb and then back at the door, whining with urgency, his posture stiff and aggressive. "What is it?" Clara asked, horrified. "He smells someone," Caleb said grimly, putting a hand on the doorframe to stop Clara from trying the key again. "Or he smells that someone was here very recently who doesn't belong." The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. The safe haven of Clara's home had been breached, or at least attempted, and the enemy was closer and more organized than they had ever imagined. The sharp whine of a power drill cut through the tense silence in Clara's apartment, a surprisingly comforting sound in its practicality. Caleb stood by the front door, his brow furrowed in concentration as he drove 3-inch steel screws into the strike plate of the doorframe. He wasn't just repairing the damage from the failed break-in attempt. He was fortifying the perimeter. Clara watched him from her kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. It was strange to have a man she'd only ever nodded to politely in the elevator now deconstructing her entryway with the practiced confidence of a professional engineer. But it was Kaiser who truly owned the space. The big German Shepherd was no longer just visiting. He was on patrol. He moved through Clara's living room with a slow, deliberate gait, sniffing the baseboards, the windows, the corners of the sofa. He was mapping the terrain, marking this territory as under his protection. Every few minutes, he would circle back to Clara, nudging her leg with his wet nose to check in, then resume his silent vigil. "That should hold," Caleb said, giving the door a final test. He had installed a heavy-duty deadbolt and reinforced the frame with a wraparound metal plate. If they want in now, they'll have to take the whole wall with them. He packed his tools into a canvas bag, his movements efficient. He walked over to the kitchen counter, accepting the fresh cup of coffee Clara offered him. "Now," Caleb began, his voice taking on a serious, analytical tone that made Clara sit up straighter. "We need to figure out the why. People don't risk a B&E on an occupied apartment in a building with cameras unless the reward is guaranteed." "Clara, how long have you lived here?" "About 6 months, Clara replied, her brow furrowing. "I took over the lease from a man who left in a hurry. The landlord said he skipped out and still owed rent." Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you know his name?" "Leo. Leo Vance, I think," Clara said, trying to remember. "I still get mail for him sometimes, mostly junk. But a few weeks ago, something that looked like a court summons came." Caleb pulled out his phone. "Leo Vance," he repeated, typing the name into a search bar. He scrolled for a moment, and his expression hardened. "Here we go. Arrested 2 years ago in connection with a high-end jewel theft ring operating out of the Hill Country. He was released on a technicality pending trial, then disappeared." Caleb turned the phone to show Clara a mugshot of a man with shifty eyes and a thin scar across his cheek. "If this is who lived here before you, those men aren't watching you for fun, Clara. They think Vance left something behind. Something valuable." The reality of it hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked around her cozy living room, which suddenly felt like a repository for someone else's secrets. "So, I'm living in a treasure chest," she whispered. "Potentially," Caleb said, pocketing his phone. "But knowing the motive makes them predictable. They want the apartment empty, that's why they were tracking your schedule. They wanted to grab you for your keys or scare you into leaving." He looked at her, his blue eyes intense, but kind. "I'm not going to let that happen, but you need to be ready. Kaiser and I can't be everywhere at once." For the next hour, the small living room transformed into a classroom. Caleb moved the coffee table aside. "I'm not trying to turn you into a fighter overnight," Caleb explained, positioning himself in front of her. "I want to teach you how to create space. Space equals time, and time equals survival." He showed her how to break a wrist grab, not by pulling away, but by rotating against the thumb, the hand's weakest point. He taught her a palm heel strike, a move with more force than a punch and less risk of injuring her own hand. "If someone grabs you," Caleb instructed, holding a throw pillow he'd brought from his place as a pad. "Don't be polite. You hit hard. You scream fire, not help, because people ignore help, and you run." They practiced until Clara was sweating and breathing hard. But for the first time in 24 hours, she felt a flicker of empowerment. She was no longer just a victim in a hallway. Throughout the training, Kaiser lay by the window, his head on his paws, but his eyes tracked every movement. Every time Clara landed a solid strike on the pillow, Kaiser would let out a soft woof of approval, his tail giving a slight thump on the floor. It was a moment of bonding, a strange, temporary family unit forged in the face of adversity. By late afternoon, the air in the apartment had grown heavy, and Caleb suggested a walk. "We need fresh air, and Kaiser needs to stretch his legs. Staying cooped up just lets the fear grow." They walked to the large community park a few blocks away. It was a clear autumn day, the trees exploding in reds and golds. Families were out, kids played on swings, and the normality of it all was jarring to Clara. She walked beside Caleb, who held Kaiser's leather leash loosely. "You're doing great," Caleb said, noticing her scanning the perimeter of the park, a habit she was already picking up from him. "Situational awareness. It's the best weapon you have." "I feel like I'm seeing the world differently," Clara admitted, pulling her jacket tighter against the breeze. "Like there are shadows everywhere." "The shadows were always there," Caleb said gently. "You just know how to look at them now." They reached a quieter path lined with dense hedges, away from the playground. Kaiser was trotting happily, sniffing at a pile of leaves, when his demeanor changed abruptly. It was the same transformation Clara had seen in the hallway. One moment he was a dog, the next he was a weapons system coming online. He stopped dead, his ears aimed forward like radar dishes, pointing toward a cluster of oak trees about 50 yards away near a park exit. A low growl began in his chest, vibrating up the leash to Caleb's hand. "Easy," Caleb whispered, but his eyes were already locked on the target. Standing partially obscured by a thick tree trunk was a figure in a dark windbreaker holding a phone, filming them. It was the toothpick-chewing man from the gang. The moment the man realized he'd been spotted, he turned to run. "Kaiser, get him." Caleb dropped the leash. Kaiser exploded forward. He didn't run. He flew. Grass tore under his paws as he closed the distance with terrifying speed, a black and tan missile locked on target. The man in the windbreaker glanced back, saw the beast closing in, and panic seized him. He scrambled for the street where a rusted sedan was idling, waiting. Clara watched, her hand over her mouth, as Kaiser vaulted a park bench in a single leap. The man reached the car just as Kaiser arrived. The dog's jaws snapped shut inches from the man's ankle as he dove into the back seat. The car door slammed into Kaiser's muzzle, but the dog didn't yelp. He just threw his weight against the metal, barking furiously, clawing at the glass. Tires squealed, burning rubber as the car tore away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a frustrated Kaiser standing in the middle of the road. Caleb ran up, whistling a sharp recall. Kaiser immediately broke off the chase and trotted back to Caleb, though he kept looking over his shoulder at the receding car. Caleb knelt, checking Kaiser's nose for injury. "Good boy," he murmured, reattaching the leash. He stood and looked at Clara, his jaw set in a hard line. "They're not just watching the apartment. They're watching us. We need to escalate this." The psychological war began not with a bang, but with the shrill, persistent ringing of a telephone that sliced through the dead of night. For the third night in a row, Clara was jolted awake at exactly 3:00 a.m. Her cell phone screen glowed in the darkness, displaying a restricted number. When she finally worked up the courage to answer, there was no voice on the other end, just heavy, rhythmic breathing followed by a distorted recording of a children's lullaby that cut off abruptly. It was juvenile, but in the context of the last few days, it was terrifying. By Wednesday, the harassment had moved from the digital world to her doorstep. Leaving for work, Clara found a small cardboard box sitting on her doormat. Inside wasn't a bomb, but something more cruel, a porcelain doll, its face smashed in, lying on a bed of dead black roses. Tucked with it was a scribbled note. "Finders keepers, losers weepers." The message was clear. They knew where she lived. They knew she was vulnerable. And their patience was running out. Caleb saw the package before Clara could touch it. He had been waiting for her to emerge, his internal clock now synced to her schedule. "Don't touch it," he commanded, his voice calm but firm. He used a pair of rubber gloves from a pouch on his belt to bag the evidence. "They're trying to flush you out. Fear makes people make mistakes. They want you to panic and leave so they can toss the place without interference." Caleb's expression was grim. He knew the tactic well from his deployments. It was classic insurgency strategy: destabilize the target before the assault. He decided that a passive defense was no longer enough. He needed backup, but not the kind that would file a report and leave. He needed someone who understood the landscape. Later that afternoon, Caleb sat in his car, parked with a clear view of the apartment entrance. He dialed a number he hadn't used in months. Davis, a gruff voice answered on the second ring. Sergeant Davis was a man built like a vending machine, a 20-year veteran of the local police force who'd done a tour in the Marines before taking the badge. He was honest, weary, and owed Caleb a favor from a joint training operation years ago. "It's Caleb," he said simply. "I've got a situation on 4th Street. A civilian is being targeted by a crew looking for a stash left by a former tenant." "Leo Vance," Davis let out a low whistle. "That guy's slippery, Vance. Listen, Caleb, if Vance is involved, this isn't just a neighborhood nuisance. That crew is bad news. I can't post a squad car there 24/7 without a warrant or an active felony. You know the red tape." Caleb watched a suspicious sedan drive slowly past the building. "I know. I'm not asking for a squad car. I'm asking for intel. Run a plate for me, and let your patrol guys know that if they get a 911 call from this address, it's the real deal. I'm on site." Davis paused. "You're watching the girl?" "Affirmative," Caleb replied. "Watch your 6, Navy. I'll text you what I find." The tension in the building was palpable, a thick fog that seemed to affect everyone. That gloom, however, was pierced later that evening by a sudden calamity that had nothing to do with criminals. A loud thud and a cry of pain echoed from the stairwell. Caleb, who had been doing push-ups in his living room with Kaiser watching, was out his door in seconds. Clara opened her door at the same moment. At the bottom of the stairs between the 2nd and 3rd floors lay Eleanor. The elderly woman had missed a step while carrying her laundry basket. "Eleanor!" Clara cried, her nurse's instincts kicking in instantly. She rushed down the stairs, Caleb right beside her. Eleanor was clutching her ankle, her face pale and contorted in pain. "Oh, dear heavens!" Eleanor moaned, trying to sit up. "My foolish old legs." Kaiser, who had followed Caleb, stopped at the top of the stairs. He whined softly, his ears drooping, sensing the distress of his favorite neighbor. He didn't rush down and crowd them. He simply sat and watched, a silent sentinel guarding the vulnerable huddle. "Don't move, Eleanor," Caleb said gently. His voice, usually so commanding, was impossibly soft. He knelt beside her, his big hands hovering over her injury. "Let Clara take a look." Clara examined the ankle with professional swiftness. "It's swelling, Eleanor. We need to get you to an ER to rule out a fracture." Eleanor tried to protest, worried about the cost and the fuss, but Caleb would have none of it. "Ma'am, you are not a fuss. You're family." He scooped the tiny woman up into his arms as easily as if she were a child. "I've got you." They took Eleanor to the hospital in Caleb's Jeep. For the next 3 hours, the threat of the gang seemed to recede, replaced by the warmth of genuine human connection. Caleb stayed in the waiting room with Kaiser, who had charmed the reception nurses into letting him stay, while Clara stayed by Eleanor's side through the x-rays. It turned out to be a severe sprain, not a break. When they got her home, Caleb carried her all the way to her sofa, and Clara arranged ice packs and pillows. "You two are angels," Eleanor whispered, her eyes watery. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Caleb smiled, patting her hand. "We look after our own here. That's the rule." It was a reminder to Clara, and perhaps to the audience watching, that strength wasn't just about fighting bad guys. It was about lifting up the people around you. But the warmth of that moment was fleeting. As night fell, the city outside seemed to grow more hostile. The wind howled through the windows, rattling the panes. Caleb insisted on staying awake, sitting in his living room with the door slightly ajar, listening to the sounds of the building. Clara was in her apartment next door, finally drifting into a fitful sleep, comforted by the knowledge that Caleb was only 10 feet away. Then, at exactly 11:45 p.m., the hum of the refrigerator died. The streetlights outside the window flickered and went out. Total and sudden darkness. It wasn't a citywide outage. Caleb could see the lights in the building across the street. This was local. Someone had cut the main power to their building. Caleb rose slowly from his chair, moving with the practiced silence of a hunter. He reached for the tactical flashlight on his belt but didn't turn it on yet. "Kaiser," he whispered. The dog was already up. Kaiser was lying on the rug by the door, his body rigid. His ears were pricked forward, twitching independently. In the suffocating silence of the blackout, the human ear could hear nothing but the wind. But Kaiser heard it. Scrape, step, pause. Someone was in the hallway, not walking, but creeping. A soft sound, like leather sliding on carpet. Kaiser didn't bark. He knew the protocol. In a stealth situation, silence was their ally. A low, vibrating growl began deep in his throat, audible only to Caleb. The dog's eyes were locked on the crack beneath the door, where a shadow darker than the surrounding night had just blocked the dim ambient light. They were here, and this time they weren't leaving a note. The darkness inside the apartment building wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. Inside apartment 3A, Clara stood frozen in the middle of her living room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed the power cut was shattered by a sound that turned her blood to ice. The splintering crunch of metal on wood. Someone was prying at her front door. The reinforced strike plate Caleb had installed was holding, but the wood around it groaned in protest under the assault of a heavy crowbar. Panic, sharp and white-hot, threatened to overwhelm her. But the memory of Caleb's voice from their training session cut through the fear. Space equals time. She needed a fortress. Clara backed away, her socks sliding on the hardwood floor, and retreated to the bathroom. It was the only room with a solid, lockable door and no windows facing the hallway. She slammed the door shut, turned the bolt, and sank to the floor, her trembling fingers gripping her phone. The light from the screen was blinding in the pitch black. She typed a single, desperate message to Caleb. "They're breaking in." In apartment 3B, the vibration of the phone in Caleb's pocket was redundant. He was already moving. He had heard the sound of splintering wood next door the moment it started. Standing in the middle of his own dark living room, Caleb closed his eyes for a brief second, taking a single, deep, centering breath. To anyone else, the situation was a nightmare. To Caleb, it was a familiar landscape. The surge of adrenaline, the sharpening of the senses, the slowing of time. It took him back 7 years, to a moonless night in a dusty valley in Kandahar. He remembered the feeling of waiting in a raid stack, the chaos of a breach, and the absolute clarity that comes when the mission goes dynamic. In that memory, chaos wasn't the enemy. It was a tool. Panic was for the unprepared. He opened his eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, tactical calculus. He looked down at Kaiser. The German Shepherd was a shadow within the darkness, his body coiled tight, his eyes reflecting the dim ambient light from the city outside. No verbal command was needed. The bond between handler and dog, forged in the fire of combat and strengthened in the quiet of retirement, was telepathic. Kaiser knew the enemy was close. He was vibrating with the need to engage, but he awaited the release. Caleb knew the hallway was a kill zone. If he went out his front door, he would be silhouetted against the emergency exit lights, a perfect target for armed men already on edge. He needed an angle they wouldn't expect. He needed to be the ghost in the machine. He moved silently to the sliding glass door of his balcony. The wind outside was howling, masking the sound of the latch opening. The two apartments' balconies were separated only by a waist-high brick divider. It was a dangerous maneuver in the dark, 4 stories up, but it was the only way to flank them. Caleb stepped out into the biting wind. "Kaiser, up!" he whispered. The dog didn't hesitate. It leapt onto the patio furniture Caleb had pushed against the wall and, with a boost from Caleb's powerful arm, scrambled over the divider onto Clara's balcony. Caleb vaulted silently after him. Inside Clara's apartment, the front door finally gave way with a sickening crack. Splinters of wood flew across the entryway as the door swung open, slamming against the wall. Heavy boots stomped onto the floor. Beams from tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping erratically around the room, illuminating the horror in disjointed flashes. An overturned chair, the empty sofa, the closed bathroom door. "Find the girl. Get the keys for the floor safe." A rough voice barked. It was the leader, the man in the leather jacket. "Tear this place apart until you find the stash." The 2 other men fanned out, overturning bookshelves and ripping cushions apart. They were loud, arrogant, and sloppy. They assumed the woman was helpless. They assumed they owned the dark. On the balcony, Caleb watched through the glass. He could see the light beams dancing inside. He knelt and gripped Kaiser's harness. The dog's breathing was slow, controlled. Caleb brought his mouth close to the dog's ear. This was the moment Kaiser had been bred, trained, and lived for. He wasn't a pet right now. He was a guided missile. Caleb slid the balcony door open. It was unlocked. Clara had forgotten it in her panic. Or perhaps fate had left it open. The wind rushed into the room, sending the curtains flying. One of the thugs, the one near the kitchen, paused. "Did you hear that?" he asked, shining his light toward the window. "It's just the wind, you idiot. Grab the laptop." The leader yelled from the hallway. Caleb released the harness. "Go," he whispered into the dark. Kaiser didn't bark. A barking dog warns you. A hunting dog stalks you. He entered the living room like smoke. The thick rug muffled his pause. He moved low to the ground, a phantom weaving through the furniture. The thug in the kitchen turned back to the window, the beam of his flashlight playing across the floor. He saw nothing. He swept the light up, and for a split second, the beam caught a pair of amber eyes glowing with primal intensity, suspended in midair in the middle of a leap. The man didn't even have time to raise his hands. Kaiser hit him in the chest with 80 pounds of muscle and kinetic energy. The impact made a sickening thud. The man was thrown backward, crashing into the kitchen counter, his flashlight spinning across the floor, creating a strobe effect in the chaos. Then the screaming started. It wasn't a yell of anger, it was the high-pitched, primal shriek of a man who has realized he is no longer at the top of the food chain. Kaiser had him pinned, his jaws clamped tight on the attacker's padded jacket sleeve, shaking his head violently to subdue the threat. "What was that? What is that?" the second thug yelled, swinging his flashlight around wildly. He saw his partner on the ground, writhing, grappling with a black beast that seemed to have materialized from the shadows. Panic erupted. The carefully planned heist dissolved into chaos. "Shoot it. Shoot the dog." The leader roared, pulling a handgun from his waistband, but he couldn't get a clear shot. His own man was in the way and the dog was moving too fast, a blur of fur and teeth. From the bathroom, Clara heard the crash and the screams. She pressed her ear to the door, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew that sound. It wasn't the police. It was Kaiser. Her guardian had arrived, and she knew with a sudden, fierce certainty that Caleb was right behind him. Caleb stepped through the curtains, his silhouette framed by the city lights behind him. He didn't have a gun. He held a heavy tactical baton he had retrieved from his go bag. He didn't look like a neighbor anymore. In the flickering light of the spinning flashlight, he looked like an avenging demon. "Drop the weapon," Caleb said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the screaming and the wind like a razor. The leader spun, leveling his gun at Caleb, but the distraction of the dog had cost him his tactical advantage. The psychological tide had turned. The hunters had become the hunted, and the apartment at the end of the hall had just become a trap. The living room of apartment 3A had become a chaotic theater of war, lit only by the strobing flashes of the rolling flashlight and the dim amber glow of the city filtering through the open balcony door. The wind howled through the opening, carrying the smell of rain and ozone to mingle with the acrid scent of fear and sweat inside the room. Caleb moved with a fluid economy that belied the violence of the moment. He was no longer the polite neighbor who held the elevator door. He was a precision instrument of combat, his mind processing threats in milliseconds. The thug Kaiser had pinned was screaming, a high-pitched sound of pure terror as the German shepherd held him fast, 80 pounds of growling muscle ensuring he couldn't get up. That left two. The leader, still brandishing the handgun near the hallway, and the third man, the driver from the park, who had recovered from his initial shock and was now charging Caleb with a raised crowbar. Caleb didn't retreat. He stepped into the arc of the swing, moving inside the attacker's defense. It was a counterintuitive act of bravery. The crowbar whistled harmlessly past his shoulder. In one fluid motion, Caleb drove the steel head of his tactical baton into the man's solar plexus. The air left the thug's lungs in a wet gasp. Before the man could double over, Caleb swept his legs, sending him crashing to the floor with a heavy thud. A quick, calculated strike to the wrist followed, neutralizing the weapon hand. The driver groaned and curled into a ball, the fight completely drained from him in less than 5 seconds. "Don't move!" Caleb yelled, his voice a thunderclap over the wind, commanding absolute compliance. He turned his attention to the leader, the man in the leather jacket. But the dynamics of the room had shifted catastrophically. While Caleb was disabling the driver, the leader had realized he was outmatched. Panic, the most dangerous emotion in a gunman, had taken over. He knew he couldn't shoot the dog without hitting his own man, and he couldn't get a beat on Caleb before being overwhelmed. He needed leverage. He needed a shield. The leader holstered his gun and kicked the bathroom door. The cheap wood, already weakened by the earlier assault on the front door, splintered near the lock. He reached in blindly, grabbing a fistful of Clara's sweater. Clara screamed as she was dragged from her hiding place, her feet sliding on the floor. The leader pulled her into the center of the room, spinning her around so her back was to his chest. In his other hand, a serrated hunting knife glinted in the erratic light. He pressed the cold blade to the soft skin of her throat. "Back off!" the leader screamed, his voice cracking. "Back off now or I slit her throat. Call off the dog." The room froze, the violence suspended in a fragile, terrifying equilibrium. Caleb stopped 10 feet away, his baton lowered. He raised his left hand, palm open, a universal gesture of calm. "Take it easy, Caleb said, his voice shifting instantly from command to negotiation. He didn't look at Clara. He kept his eyes locked on the leader's face, reading the twitch of his muscles, the sweat beating on his forehead. You don't want to do this. Burglary is one thing. Murder is life without parole. Just walk away. Kaiser, sensing the standoff, had released the first thug, who was now either unconscious or playing dead, and trotted to Caleb's side. The dog stood rigid, a low, vibrating growl emitting from his chest, his eyes locked on the knife. He was a compressed spring awaiting the command to release. Shut up. The leader yelled, pressing the knife harder. A tiny bead of blood appeared on Clara's neck. Drop the stick. Kick it over here. Clara was paralyzed. The smell of the man's stale cigarette breath and the cold steel on her neck made her dizzy. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked at Caleb in the shadows. His face was a mask of concentration, but his eyes were making her a promise that he would not let her die. Space equals time, he had said. Create an opening. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight him, but she wasn't helpless. She remembered the lesson in her living room just days before. The foot is a complex structure, Caleb had said. Stomp hard enough and the brain reboots for a second. She took a breath, steeling herself. The leader screamed at Caleb again, distracted by his own fear. Clara shifted her weight. She brought her right foot up, aimed blindly, and brought her heel down with all her might onto the leader's instep. The crunch was audible. The leader howled in pain, his balance broken. Reflexively, his grip on her loosened, and he staggered back, the knife leaving her throat for a split second. It was all the time Caleb needed. Kaiser, hit. Caleb roared. The command cracked like a whip. Kaiser launched himself across the gap. He didn't go for the throat or the legs. He went for the weapon. His jaws clamped down on the leader's right forearm, the knife hand, with the force of a hydraulic press. The leader screamed again, dropping the knife as the sheer power of the dog drove him backward. They hit the floor together, Kaiser shaking his head violently, savaging the man's arm to ensure he couldn't reach for the gun in his waistband. Caleb was there a heartbeat later. He grabbed Clara's arm and moved her gently but firmly behind him, shielding her with his body. Then he stepped over the writhing leader. With efficient brutality, Caleb placed a knee on the man's shoulder and applied pressure to a nerve cluster in his neck. The leader's struggle ceased instantly as his body went limp, overwhelmed by pain and shock. Caleb reached into his back pocket, produced a heavy-duty zip tie, a familiar item for a man in his line of work, and secured the man's hands behind his back. Kaiser, Caleb commanded softly. The dog immediately released the arm and backed off, sitting and looking at Caleb, awaiting his next order, his chest heaving, but his tail giving a single, satisfied thump. The room was silent, save for the wind whistling through the open balcony and the heavy breathing of the combatants. Caleb stood, scanning the room to ensure the other two were still down. They were. He turned to Clara. She was standing by the wall, her hands shaking uncontrollably, touching the small cut on her neck. Caleb walked to her, his baton now holstered, his hands gentle. He placed them on her shoulders, steadying her. You did good, Clara, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. You did exactly what you needed to do. You're safe now. We got them. Clara looked at the chaos around her. The broken furniture, the subdued criminals, and the magnificent dog standing guard over them. And then she looked at Caleb. She collapsed into his chest, sobbing, not out of weakness, but in the overwhelming relief of survival. The wail of sirens cut through the storm, a symphony signaling the end of the siege and the restoration of order. Within minutes, the quiet street outside the apartment complex was awash in the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen patrol cars. Sergeant Davis was the first through the door of apartment 3A, his weapon drawn but lowered as he took in the scene. He saw three intruders, zip-tied and lined up against a wall, looking bruised and defeated. He saw Caleb standing calmly by the balcony, wiping a smear of grime from his face, and Kaiser sitting at his feet, alert, but no longer in attack mode. Davis holstered his weapon and let out a low whistle, shaking his head with a weary grin. I told dispatch to send backup, Davis said, stepping over a broken chair leg. But it looks like you and the fur missile had it covered. Caleb gave a tired nod. They were looking for something, Davis. They tore the place up before we stopped them. The leader mentioned a floor safe. Davis motioned for two uniformed officers to take the suspects into custody. As the criminals were led away, protesting and groaning, a team of detectives began a systematic search of the apartment. It didn't take long. In the small utility closet off the kitchen, under a loose floorboard that had been hidden by a bag of dog food Clara had bought for Kaiser, they found it. It wasn't a safe, but a hollowed-out space in the subfloor. Davis reached in with a gloved hand and pulled out a heavy velvet drawstring bag. He loosened the knot and poured the contents onto the kitchen counter. Even under the harsh glare of police flashlights, they sparkled with a cold, mesmerizing fire. Diamonds. Dozens of them. Uncut and raw. The Hill Country heist, Davis muttered, his eyes wide. Leo Vance's retirement fund. He must have stashed them here right before he got pinched, figured he'd come back for them. He looked at Clara. You've been sleeping on $3 million worth of stolen gems. Clara, who was sitting on the sofa with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, stared at the stones in disbelief. The horror of the night was slowly being replaced by shock. I had no idea, she whispered. I just thought the floor was creaky. By the time the police finished processing the scene, the sun was beginning to crest the Austin skyline, painting the clouds in bruised purples and soft pinks. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh. When Caleb and Clara stepped out into the hall, they were met not by an empty corridor, but by a community. The commotion had woken the entire floor. Doors were open, and neighbors were gathered, whispering and pointing. At the center of it all, reigning like a queen on a throne, was Eleanor. Despite her sprained ankle, she had insisted her nephew wheel her out on her office chair. Eleanor beamed when she saw them. There they are, she announced, her voice ringing with pride. The heroes of the third floor. She turned to Mrs. Higgins from 3C and Mr. Henderson from 3D. I told you all. I told you that Caleb was a good man, and I told you that Dog was smarter than half the people in this building. She recounted the story of the night as if she had been in the room, embellishing the details with the flair of a seasoned storyteller. They came like thieves in the night, but they didn't count on our Navy SEAL and his wolf. Saved our dear Clara, they did. The neighbors closed in, offering quiet thanks and words of awe. Someone handed Clara a thermos of hot tea. Another neighbor patted Caleb on the back. It was a deeply warming scene, a testament to the resilience of ordinary people when protected by one of their own. Caleb, normally uncomfortable with praise, found himself smiling. He looked at Clara, who was being hugged by Mrs. Higgins. She looked safe. That was all that mattered. Kaiser, sensing the relaxed atmosphere, allowed himself to be petted by the neighbors, soaking up the attention with a dignified tail wag. I need to take him out, Caleb said to Clara a short while later, gesturing to the dog. He's been on duty all night. He needs a break. Clara nodded, her eyes full of a gratitude that went beyond words. Be careful, she said automatically. Caleb chuckled. The bad guys are in cuffs, Clara. We'll be okay. Caleb clipped the leash to Kaiser's harness and took the elevator down to the lobby. The street outside was still busy with a few remaining patrol cars, but the main activity had died down. Davis was finishing his paperwork in his vehicle. Caleb gave him a wave and walked Kaiser down the block toward a patch of green space near the corner, away from the flashing lights. The morning air was crisp, filling his lungs. Caleb felt the tension leave his shoulders. It was over. The threat was neutralized. The mystery was solved. He let Kaiser sniff around a fire hydrant, waiting patiently. The street was relatively deserted, except for a dark sedan idling near the intersection, its engine humming. Caleb didn't pay it much mind. It looked like another commuter waiting for the light to change. He turned his back to the car to check his phone, planning to order breakfast for himself and Clara. Suddenly, the hum of the engine turned into a roar. It wasn't a gradual acceleration. It was the sound of a gas pedal being slammed to the floor. Tires screeched on the damp pavement. The sound triggered an instant, primal alarm in Caleb's brain. He whipped around. The dark sedan he had ignored was no longer idling. It had jumped the curb and was now rocketing down the sidewalk, straight toward them. Behind the wheel, eyes wild with panic and rage, was a fourth man, the getaway driver who had waited outside all night, watched his crew get arrested, watched his payday disappear, and decided to eliminate the person responsible. Caleb. Davis's voice yelled from down the street, but he was too far away. The car was 50 feet away and closing, a 2-ton weapon of steel and glass. There was no time to run to the side. The building wall was on their left and a row of parked cars on their right. They were cornered. The driver wasn't trying to scare them. He was trying to kill them. Caleb had a split second to react. He couldn't outrun the car. He dropped the leash. It wasn't a calculated, tactical decision. It was pure instinct. But before Caleb could shove Kaiser out of the way, the dog moved. Kaiser didn't run away. He didn't cower. He saw the threat coming for his handler, and he did the only thing he knew how to do. He launched himself, not at the car, but at Caleb. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and noise. Caleb had no time to brace himself. He just felt the sudden, heavy impact of 80 pounds of muscle slamming into his side. Kaiser didn't nudge him. The dog tackled him with the force of a linebacker, shoving Caleb off the sidewalk and onto the damp grass of the parkway. In that same split second, the black sedan roared through the empty space where Caleb had been standing a heartbeat before. The wind from the passing car whipped Caleb's hair, it was so close. There was no screech of brakes, just the sickening thud of metal hitting an immovable object. The sedan jumped the curb and wrapped its front bumper around a thick steel light pole. Steam immediately erupted from the crushed radiator, billowing into the morning air like a white flag of surrender. The driver, saved by his airbag but stunned from the impact, slumped over the steering wheel. Caleb scrambled to his feet, ignoring the grass stains on his jeans. His first instinct wasn't to check the car, but the dog. Kaiser was already on his feet, shaking his coat as if he'd just finished a casual stroll in the park. He looked at Caleb, his tail wagging tentatively, waiting for approval. "You crazy mutt." Caleb gasped, dropping to his knees and wrapping his arms around the dog's thick neck. "You saved me. You actually saved me." Kaiser licked the side of Caleb's face, sensing the relief in his master's voice. Sergeant Davis was there seconds later, weapon drawn, pulling the dazed driver from the wrecked car and cuffing him on the hood. "You've got 9 lives, Navy," Davis yelled over the hissing engine, shaking his head in disbelief. "And a guardian angel with 4 legs." The final threat was over, definitively. The driver was hauled away, the last remnant of the gang that had terrorized the 3rd floor. 3 days later, the autumn chill had mellowed into a glorious Indian summer afternoon. The Austin sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue and the air smelled of charcoal and grilling chicken. On the rooftop of the apartment building, a small celebration was underway. It wasn't a huge party, just the people who mattered. Mrs. Higgins had brought her famous potato salad, and Mr. Henderson was manning the grill, flipping burgers with surprising dexterity. But the guests of honor were sitting at a patio table near the edge of the roof, looking out at the skyline. Clara sat next to Eleanor, who had her sprained ankle propped up on a cushion but refused to let it dampen her spirits. Eleanor was wearing her best Sunday hat and sipping an iced tea. "I always said this building needed some excitement," Eleanor chuckled, gesturing with her glass. "Though I would have preferred a bingo night to a diamond heist." Clara laughed, a sound that was light and free of the tension that had gripped her for weeks. She looked different now, more confident, her shoulders relaxed. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. "I think I've had enough excitement to last a lifetime, Eleanor. I'm ready for boring." Caleb stood by the railing, looking out over the city. He wore a simple white t-shirt and aviator sunglasses, holding a bottle of soda. Kaiser lay at his feet, gnawing on a high-quality beef bone Clara had bought him from the butcher shop. The dog was the center of attention, receiving pets and scratches from every neighbor who walked by. He absorbed the love with a regal calm, his tail giving an occasional thump on the deck. Clara walked over to join Caleb at the railing. The wind played with the loose strands of her hair. "It's beautiful up here," she said quietly. "Peaceful." "It is," Caleb agreed, turning to look at her. "You held up well, Clara. Most people would have folded. You fought back." "I had a good teacher," she smiled, giving his arm a gentle nudge. "So, what happens now?" "Davis said the diamonds are evidence, but the reward money." "It's yours," Caleb interrupted. "It was in your apartment. Consider it rent for the inconvenience." He paused, his expression turning bittersweet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I got the call this morning, Clara. My leave is up. I have to report back to base in Virginia by 0800 tomorrow." The smile faded slightly from Clara's lips. She had known this was coming. Caleb was a SEAL. He didn't belong in apartment 3B. He belonged to the mission. But knowing it didn't make the sinking feeling in her stomach any less real. "Oh," she said, her voice small. "So soon?" "The team's spinning up for a workup cycle. Training, then deployment," Caleb explained. He looked down at Kaiser. "I'm driving out tonight. I have a house near base with a big yard. Kaiser's coming with me. He's retired from the teams, but he's still my responsibility. He needs room to run." Clara nodded, blinking back a sudden rush of tears. "Of course, he deserves a yard. He deserves everything." Caleb reached into his pocket again and pulled out something small. It was a dog collar, made of tactical nylon, frayed and worn at the edges. It was Kaiser's old operational collar. "I want you to have this," Caleb said, pressing it into her hand. "It's his spare. I know we've only known each other a week, but you're part of the pack now, Clara. This is a promise." "All right." And when I get my next leave, I'm coming back to Austin. We have unfinished business. He gestured vaguely at the burgers and the sunset, but his eyes said he meant something much more personal. Clara clutched the collar, the rough fabric reassuring. You'd better, she whispered. Or I'll send Eleanor after you. Caleb laughed, a genuine, warm sound. I'm more scared of her than I am of the enemy. He let out a low whistle. Kaiser, here. The German shepherd got to his feet and trotted over. He didn't go to Caleb. He went straight to Clara. He pressed his heavy head against her leg, leaning his full weight into her. It was a gesture of absolute trust and affection. Clara knelt, wrapping her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur one last time. He smelled of shampoo and sunshine. Thank you, boy, she whispered into his ear. Thank you for watching over me. Kaiser whined softly and licked the tears from her cheek. An hour later, the sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the street. Caleb's Jeep Wrangler was packed, the engine idling. Clara and Eleanor stood on the sidewalk. Eleanor was leaning on her cane, waving enthusiastically. Don't be a stranger, young man, she called out. Caleb leaned out the window, a rare, charming grin on his face. Hold the fort, ladies. He put the vehicle in gear. As the Jeep pulled away from the curb, merging into the evening traffic, Clara didn't watch Caleb. She watched the passenger seat. Kaiser was sitting straight up, his head out the open window, his ears flying back in the wind. As the Jeep turned at the end of the block, the dog turned his head. He looked back at the apartment building, his amber eyes finding Clara in the crowd. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent goodbye from a warrior to a friend, before he faced forward into the wind, ready for the next journey. Clara clutched the nylon collar in her hand, smiling through her tears. The hallway was empty, but she wasn't alone. She was safe. She was stronger, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that they would be back.